Okay, I'm very sorry not to get the full Warlock treatment. I thought I'd at least have one sofa. I could recline on it, and Michael could recline on the other one. But it's been cut out.
We want to get you to your drinks, so you know.
I know. That's the important thing. Michael's had quite a lot of mention the last few days. I wonder why. But he's presented his own update just now, so it cuts out some of my questions. And his biography was gone over yesterday. So a little bit...
Not everybody was there, Anthony.
No, I know, they weren't all there. Some of them were not able to get there. I couldn't afford it. Okay. I just want to say quickly that I have been told, and it actually fits in with what I would like to do, is not to go in for a lot of probing of Michael. Some of you may... BBC World Service has a thing called hard talk, where some unfortunate person is disemboweled by a man whose name escapes me at the moment. And I wasn't thinking of doing that anyhow, but Michael has told me not to do so. So I'm following a script. Not really. We haven't had a script. I wanted to start. I've known Michael for quite a long time. I've worked for him. I've enjoyed doing work for STM, which I still do in a peripheral way. I was actually originally appointed to do something by Lex Lefebvre, who's way in the past now. He's not here this year, unfortunately. I can't thank him. I revamped the intensive journals course at his command, and I enjoyed that for many years, and I handed over to Baz Straub. So, Michael, the first thing I wanted to ask you, because people here are aware of the whole question of recruitment in publishing, many people, and I talk to these people, the people who get recruited all the time. I used to teach them. How did you get into publishing originally?
Well, entirely by accident, which I think is often something that you hear from many people. I mean, basically, I was going to go and do a PhD, having done some initial research in the research lab for archaeology and the history of art in Oxford. My degree is as a chemist originally, but I was really interested in science applied to archaeology, but they didn't have a grant in those days in Oxford, so I had to go to Bath, which is where I was set up to go. And I just happened to be reading a copy of Nature in the college library, which I was invigilating to try and make up for my debts. And I spotted a really interesting job, and I didn't think that I was ever likely to get this. And this was asking for somebody to join the team at the Oxford English Dictionary Department of OUP, researching the history of scientific words. And much to my astonishment, I ended up being asked to do this job. And I thought, given the economic environment in England in 1980, that it was better to have a job than become a student again. So I ended up working for OUP as effectively a lexicographer. And it was from that point on I suddenly realised that actually some of the other things that the press did were really interesting and seemed to be things I'd never conceived of doing before.
So you joined Pergamon?
Well, Pergamon was a bit later. I mean, OUP I worked for about 5 years.
Yeah.
And then I realised that being a lexicographer was perhaps not much of a training for many things, although it's quite a good mistress in terms of applied philosophy, because you have to write definitions, you have to make sure you're looking at the quotations and find them. But I knew I needed to get out, not least because the editor-in-chief then, a certain Robert Birchfield, now dead, said to me, "Oh, you should never let a scientist over your threshold, Michael." And I thought that didn't sound like a very good career move, given I was a scientist. So I ended up working very briefly at the British Standards Institution in their technical editing department. And then I was rung up out of the blue by Pergamon Press, where they were looking for somebody to be head of their reference department. I'd obviously, because I'd worked in dictionaries, and I'd obviously at some point in the past had applied for a job there, they'd picked me up. And I ended up going and working there, initially running their scholarly encyclopedias, which were effectively like frozen review journals. And I did that for about 4 years before an opportunity arose to become a commissioning editor and have my first journal job in 1990. looking after, as a senior commissioning editor, looking after the material science portfolio for Pergamon.
So you're pre-digital, just about pre-digital.
Oh, very much so, actually. I mean, when I first started with my 38 journals list, which I and a secretary were running, some of which were huge titles. These were all in paper. We were all still selling things through agents. Nobody quite knew how many people were reading it. I mean, this was the days when libraries would discover how many people were reading it was by putting £5 notes into copies in the library. And of course, we now have a much better system of doing that. But it was a very interesting time because it was almost the high water mark of the paper world when I started.
So I would think of Michael as a scholar, and people here probably don't realise how many librarians see Michael in the guise of a scholar. In fact, some of the top information scientists in the world look upon Michael's work. What was the most important thing you've done as a researcher in scholarship?
Well, it all came about again by accident, which is a theme that I think is developing here. I was towards the tail end of my time as publishing director for material science for what was then Elsevier after Pergamon was acquired, and there was a regular report which was produced by the market research department, which used Ulrichs to tell you about journal startups and what had been successful. And I suddenly realised that there was probably data hiding within this that we haven't really sort of unpacked. And it was just one afternoon, probably a Friday, and I thought, well, I wonder what happens if I plot the start dates and numbers of journals against time on a log scale. Typical sort of scientist thing to do. And I got a straight line. And I thought this was extraordinary. You know, we're talking about going back to 1665 with Phil Trans, the very first journal, all the way up to, in those days, this would have been about sort of 1998, I guess. And you got virtually a straight line within very close fit. And that straight line suggested that titles started and still existing that were scholarly, academic, peer-reviewed, were growing at a consistent 3.5% every year for over 3 centuries. And of course that has immediate implications. Those that used to think, as indeed I think many librarians still do, that journals are caused by publishers and their greed, which we heard a little bit about last night as well, demonstrate this is actually completely wrong. It's obviously being driven by something else entirely. And when you actually dig into it, you discover that what really is doing this, it's not economics, because you're dealing with worlds that were wildly different. You know, you're talking about a monarchical early capitalist society in the 1680s. You're talking about a pre-industrial a bit later on. You're talking about early democratic and industrial in the 19th century. You're talking about post-industrial now. But the rate of increase is almost identical across all of them. And the only factor, and it's not an economic one, interestingly, is the number of researchers. It's a Malthusian thing. And it's pretty clear when you actually sit down and you talk to researcher colleagues that, you know, to be a researcher, you have to publish. For your own purposes, irrespective of anything else. And therefore, as the number of researchers goes up, the number of papers in the world goes up, and therefore, ultimately, the number of journals. And in fact, you can correlate all of these factors and see that, you know, all things being equal, this 3.5% growth wasn't even particularly stymied by the First World War. And it didn't particularly get affected too much by the Second World War. If anything, the Second World War caused it to increase slightly from about 1945 to about 1979, when it was killed off by the oil price rises and the sort of crisis, cash crisis in some of the countries. And it actually models something very close to an ecological system. It looks like you've put extra nutrient in, it's using it all up, but it doesn't just go back to any old growth rate. It goes back to the growth rate that it had for the preceding 300 years. And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Is it still the same, in spite of China?
The difficulty here is one of definition.
Yeah.
If you're talking about using Ulrichs, which is, you know, it's debatable whether that's the best source. But certainly this has been redone, and it's not just been done by me. It's been done by Carol Tenopir. It's been done by Bjork, And they're all getting a similar result. The interesting thing is, what do you do about predatory journals, for example? That's an interesting issue. And the other one is, what do you do if you don't exclude some of the other category types? Because one of the great information scientists, Derek Solar-Price, had a graph in his wonderful little book, which I still recommend people to read, called Little Science, Big Science, where it would suggest that we'd be all up to our necks in journals by now because of the rate of growth. And the problem with this was he was measuring periodicals, which is a much larger number than journals. We've got about 33 to 35,000 peer-reviewed periodicals in existence right now, whereas De Solar-Price thought we'd be in the millions, and of course that's simply not the case.
That's interesting. Of course, I've had the good fortune of working with Michael on the latest edition of the STM report, and it's been a very good experience for me to learn to talk to somebody, work with somebody who knows so much about the history of journals. I've been able to add a little bit. And Rob Johnson, is he in the audience? Right, there he is, you see. He's the third collaborator. And you will be interested to know that the STM report is used by librarians a lot. That if they want to show their patrons what journals are all about, they point them to the STM report. It's a soft influence. It's a soft influence we're doing. Okay, so during your time at STM, you funded a fair amount of research, and you kept. What is the most important thing you think you've been doing?
Oh Lord, now that is a very difficult question. I mean, I was involved in our participation in the Publishing Research Consortium. And this was a response to the fact that many of the people who had very contrary opinions to the industry were essentially commissioning tame researchers to come out with results that would satisfy the policy agenda that they had. And this cross-trade body grouping, PA, STM, ALPS, funded. The idea was that we would actually go and find people to do slightly more genuine research than some of the things we'd seen on the other side, but it was clear we needed to have things to which we could refer. And I think that's probably still true now, although regrettably the PRC is no longer in existence. And some of the things... I'm sorry? Thank you, Mark, for that support.
Please do your bit about that.
Yeah, I mean... We basically came up with a whole series of things which you can still find on the website of different results. One of them pointing out that some of the influencing factors behind author choice were not at all what people thought they were. And that actually at the end of the day it was barriers to entry more than anything else that was the issue. I mean, they weren't so concerned about access issues. They were more concerned about, will I get a grant? Will my head of department actually like where I'm publishing? Will I actually get credit for what I've done? And this was before you're even talking about the amplifying factors of what's called, in the US in particular, publish or perish. Because there is an imperative within every scholar, because they want the world to know what they've found out. I mean, I feel the same way when I publish something. I'm not going to get promoted over it. I'm not going to get rewarded over it. But I want people to know it was me who did it. And that's the most primary influencing factor behind most of the authors that you publish.
Human psychology?
Yes.
Yep. It doesn't go away. No?
No.
No. Okay. I'll just tell you that I've been funded quite a lot of research over the last so many years, including the Publishers Research Consortium. And the only time anybody's tried to get us to say what they wanted rather than what we found out was JISC. We were lent on by JISC over a project on textbooks. Yeah. So there was never any interference. It was absolutely crucial. Now let's go to the 13 years STM. I've been one of your staff, a part of it. How did you decide what functions to take on board when you did? So you've built up a staff, quite a large staff, active, very good people, who a lot of us know. How do you decide which things to do first?
I'm afraid it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, because when I was discussing with the then chair of STM, Jerry Cowig, about taking this on, I said to him, well, what's the budget? What's the staff? And essentially the staff was me. And the budget was quite limited. And his answer was, well, if you're able to increase your turnover, then obviously you can have more staff, which is sort of, what you would have expected, I suppose. But my first analysis was that part of the problem for declining membership, which was happening in the early 2000s, was actually down to the fact that you had a body that had existed as largely a sort of not large publisher, but old boys club is how it had been perceived, and therefore it wasn't really acting as a proper trade body. It was actually providing a forum for people to interact. It was going to some meetings. It had started to develop a copyright committee that was doing good work, probably better work than any of the other equivalent copyright bodies elsewhere in the industry. But that was really about it. And it seemed to me that in 2005, when I was being interviewed, the thing that was top of mind, and had been top of mind for me as a staff member, doing strategy type stuff in Elsevier, was obviously open access development, open access policy, and all of this was going on in the context, in part, of stuff that was going on in the US with the NIH situation, but it was also going on in Europe, where they'd commissioned an economic report into scholarly publishing, which was very flawed, but it was actually the starting point for their policies on open access. So it seemed to me that the thing that was really top of mind, given that copyright was partly being dealt with through member support, was to actually, and we did have a lawyer that we'd retained, was we needed to do something on public policy. We needed to have somebody who could help me go around the world and fight the good fight on our behalf. And so we did two things. We looked at the internal structure of STM, where in fact this is a rather boring bit of this, but it's relevant, because originally there were only 8 fee categories for members. They were completely static. You fell into a particular turnover band, and that's what you paid. And basically, if you were in the top band, so you're talking about the top, 25, 30 companies, every time they bought one another, we lost a member. And as they got bigger, we didn't get any more income. It was exactly the same. So that was something that had to be changed. And in the process of changing that, which I did a year in, we were able to increase our resources to be able to employ our public affairs director, which is still Barbara Kaluminos, who came and joined me then. And that was the first stage. The second stage was to look at really important issues connected with technology. And I'd worked with Eefke Schmidt when I was at Elsevier, and she was also somebody who was available and interested. So we asked Eefke if she'd come on board to look after our technology portfolio, because we could see back then this was going to be really, really important, as we know now today. So that was the next stage. And then it was just a question of how do you strengthen the organisation to deliver what members want? And it's a classic example. The more you deliver what people want, the more people join, the more you're able to deliver what people want. And as I showed you earlier, that the effect of that was that over the 13 years, we've doubled the membership. And we've now increased our services to cover the whole gamut of what I think a modern trade body should be doing for its members.
Good. What's something that came out in the panel you've just been looking after, I thought very well, personally. I just say that quickly as a compliment. The question of CrossRef came up, and we always say CrossRef as an example of the innovation in the industry getting together. An amazing thing. It's a rather long time ago. What's happened since then?
Well, I think there's been a number of similar types of initiatives. I mean, ORCID is one of them. This is the a unique identifier for authors, and there are similar things like it. I mean, I think we always have to understand that when quite rightly Judy said we'd not been very quick to do some of this stuff, I think you've always got to remember that stuff that involves more than one company becomes complicated. It's not complicated in part because you have issues of natural suspicion between the companies, but it's also complicated because you have to stay secure in terms of the legal processes that you're operating under. I mean, the CrossRef example is a good one because the first idea of this was being floated at the time that Bob Campbell was chairman of STM, and this would have been probably about 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
And the experience of everybody who was moving into the early phase of going electronic was we all wanted to strike deals with our competitors to have referencing so that you could go from one journal link to another. But the whole thing was being done on a bilateral basis. And I remember pursuing a discussion with David Pullinger at Nature to try and set it up for my journals. And the end result was that you ended up with something that looked like an explosion in a spaghetti factory. It was just, completely illogical. And so the idea of having an intermediary that everybody linked to simplify it was a bit of a no-brainer. But it took quite a lot of persuasive power over a number of years before it became the case that everybody accepted that this was the best way forward. And I think that's going to be true of any initiative like this. There's an old saying in trade and body land that we all live in the tragedy of the commons, because we do. The trade body people can often see where we ought to be, as indeed many of the companies can. But it doesn't happen because it's not in anybody's one interest to do it. And so that's really quite a difficult hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, so I was sitting next to Icebrand and just now, and he mentioned RA21 as a major thing. It's not called that now, I know. It's been changed its name. But would you think, you're very keen on that, I know.
No, I mean, you've got to understand this came out of deep concerns about the fact that people who had legal access to our content were still using Sci-Hub because it was an easy one-stop shop. And so clearly, if you have people opting for piracy options, it's clear that you're not giving them the tools that they need. So being able to do that in a way that was sensitive, modern, would also reduce security risk is quite important. Although I have to say that when Barbara and I met with the European University Association and we pointed out to them that their servers were under severe risk, we had our heads patted and told to go away. No, we know better. And quite interestingly, about 2 weeks later, the Times came out with a front page story about how the security of university servers was completely crap, to use the technical phrase.
So we discovered recently that Thomas Crapper was nothing to do with the word crap. Have you heard the story that a man called Thomas Crapper was supposed to be the reason for the word crap? It's not at all the case. It's been exploded, let's say.
Although I have to say, the plumber I use in my village has the surname Crapper, but anyway.
It's a traditional thing. Yes, I can believe that. I want to follow on from this question, but about work with things that you haven't succeeded in doing. The library problem, how does one work with libraries more successfully?
I mean, the big problem there, and I thought this when I was Director of Academic Relations at Elsevier, when I'd invented this department that was a combination of research, communication, and also trying to improve understanding, was that when you went out there, I mean, a lot of the library schools inculcate an attitude about publishers very, very early on. So that one of the early things I tried then, this is before STM, was to try and do a pre-conference at the Charleston Library Conference, which is called a Publishing 101, because it struck me that part of the problem was that we were having conversations at this level, and library knowledge was sort of at this level. And I don't know whether that was really very successful, because I'm afraid even the people we got there had already had their minds made up for them before they joined in the course, which I did jointly, incidentally, with Carol Tenopir, probably the best of the journal usage and value.
Carol's probably one of the great information scientists of the present day and is recognised as such. And she's had Michael be teaching for her on her courses. But yes, what's the next step with librarians, do you think?
Well, I think there is an increasing realisation when I talk to them that actually that jaw is better than war. That doesn't mean you still don't have some pockets of significant agitation, shall I say. But I do think there is the beginnings of an understanding that things are not as simple as they thought, that the world is actually more complex and more various, and that actually it's more dynamic than static, because a library view of the world has a tendency to be a static view rather than a dynamic view, whereas the publisher view is always that things are in flux, they're changing. We have to make sure our journals are kept up to date by changing the editor, by changing policies, by making sure you do what authors want. Libraries are not so aware of that. For them, they just see the publisher as the man who sends them, or woman for that matter, who sends them the check, and the bill rather, and that I think is always going to be a tension point.
Very true, I think. Would you say that there is, if we're talking about, as we are, rightly so, working to make what we do clearer to researchers, that the fact that librarians are in the way to some extent, in the way you described, is rather difficult, because researchers naturally turn to the librarians if they want to know about what journal they should be publishing.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, actually. I think that academic sociology is a really interesting area. And as you know from the work you've done on early career researchers, a lot of it is very analogous to the way clerical stuff happened in the Middle Ages and later. You had a master, you learnt from a master, you then inculcated the people who followed you on in the same way, and there's still a large element of that. So the supervisor, the principal researcher, has a lot of influence. And certainly my experience when I was publishing in material science was that essentially there were probably 5 journals they wanted to get into because it was in their field what you did, and they'd probably been told that when they first started. And then they may also have had a slightly broader range of stuff for the stuff that wasn't right at the top of their best work, as it were, but things where they wanted to publish anyway. And they'd also read a much wider set of journals than they'd actually publish in. I'm not entirely sure they would go necessarily to the publisher. I think that's very field dependent.
Okay, I think the librarians try very hard to be seen as centre of scholarship in their university.
I'm sure they do. I'm not sure that's actually how the scholars think about it. I mean, some of the ones I've met take the attitude, well, why would I go to the librarian? That's, rather than why would I go to the janitor, for example? They have that sort of same sense about it. Yeah, I think going electronic has made it more extreme in the sense that because they think they don't actually need a physical library, they like to conclude, like the general public concludes that, books are electronic, therefore they don't have any value, therefore you don't have to pay for them. You've got exactly the same dynamic going on. Well, I get my stuff at home or in my office. Why would I go to the library? And I think increasingly they don't. And that means that the librarians, I think, have an existential crisis as much as perhaps we have had.
I think you're right. I think they recognise that as intermediaries we're all having existential crises. I want to ask now a big question, which I might not ask you, but I'm going to do, because there's another 4 or 5 minutes before the drink is all finished by the people outside there, naughtily swigging all the STM wine, and no doubt, in their case, whiskey, I suppose. You never know. They might have brought it in. Do you have a particular... We had a lot of vision today, some quite interesting vision. Have you got a vision for the future of STM publishing, Michael? I said I'd probably not ask you this question, because it's pretty... I know you don't like these nebulous things. It's not your line, really.
It depends on what timescale you're talking. I mean, okay. I think that actually the more you look at the sociology of researchers, the more you might conclude that a lot of the fundamentals are not changing very much, even if the mechanisms by which they operate have definitely changed. And in a way you can see this through the whole history of the journal world. People always say, oh well, back in 1665 it was in paper, and that's a different world now. Well, yes, that's true, but the journals now still do the things that they were invented to do by Oldenburg, and those things were about sociological expectations on the part of investigators. I mean, back then, the concern was that other investigators would steal their ideas. And so what they wanted was somewhere that they could register what they'd done, they could say they did it before somebody else, that they would get the credit. And these are people who are not on grants, remember. They're independently wealthy. Yeah. They're amateurs. They've got none of the infrastructure that we now have. But this still mattered to them. And they fought cat and dog over it. But what he was clever enough to do was to understand that if you secured their first discoverer rights and that you provided a mechanism by which people could be confident that they had done this, and that you also had some kind of filtering going on so that not everything got published, and that you made sure there was a continuous record of what was coming out. These are the four cardinal functions of the journal: registration, certification, dissemination, and archive. And they're still true now, even though we do them in a completely different way. Now, I think those derive ultimately from simple issues of vanity and ego that we all have. And while human beings still have vanity and ego, I think some of those things are still going to be true. So I would say that in the medium term, you might deliver it in a different way, and I can't say anything about what business models may or may not work, because I think that's another issue. But if you look at the true core of what it is that makes the journal what it is and what it might be in the future, it relates down to that human element of recognition and reward. And that doesn't change. You know, our forebears were no different to us. They just had slightly different technology.
I think that's a good point. And I would just encourage everybody here that the work we've been doing on attitudes, early career researchers in scholarly communication, has revealed to us that the publishers are not hated as much as one might expect. In fact, publishers are recognized as being important in organizing the scholarly communication system. That is quite a surprise, actually. Alternatives produced are not satisfying.
It reminds me of when I became a faculty member at various institutions, albeit adjunct or visiting or whatever. And I did think, oh dear, I'm a publisher. I'm going to be I'm going to be seen as the interloper here. But the reality in Knoxville, in Tennessee, which is where I taught on 3 or 4 occasions at summer school, was that wasn't the case at all. The enemy was not regarded as the publisher. The enemy was the university administration.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think we should always remember that actually, particularly scholars in the US, they see the administration as a thing that gets in the way of them doing stuff.
And we know that we did you financed some work was financed on the barriers to research felt by researchers in particular fields, and it was the funders that came up much higher than the publishers. Publishers are quite well down. Now, that happy note, I'm going to finish now because it's now time. I'm quite good at keeping time because I have to do it at the Charleston Conference in South Carolina every year. And I've just done it now. And thank you very much, Michael, for all you've done.
Well, thank you all for your fellowship.